This video was sponsored by Surfshark VPN.
Have you ever made a gay person? Well, chances are you're some kind of fruit, and aren't we all in the making? But first, Oakland, 1991. Winds from Diablo Valley push a brush fire through the Hiller Highlands, through the Bay Area. The brush fire is soon to become one of the deadliest and most destructive wildfires in California history. At the time, one of the East Bay's residents was a man named Will Wright, at the time, pretty successful video game designer who developed titles such as SimCity, a city-building simulation game, and the massively successful SimAnt, an ant simulator. But then Will Wright lost everything to the fires. And sometimes all it takes is a matter of a change in perspective. In the process of rebuilding his own life, Will Wright thought, "Dude, living? I could get used to this. What if life was a game? What if I could play a person playing the computer on my computer?" And thus, Dollhouse Simulator was born. The idea was, create a game that would simulate the choices and consequences of life. You could poop, you could pee, anything was possible. Throughout the 90s, Will Wright workshopped the project, but Mr. Boss, head of company, kept telling him, Dollhouse Simulator? Can you make it more masculine? And thus, Home Tactics, the experimental domestic simulator, was born. Yeah, finally, a game for men. Wait a second. Wasn't Joseph Stalin a man? We can't do that. Let's just call it. And thus, The Sims was born, or was in the process of being birthed. Because now it's 1998 and the Sims development team still didn't know what to do with gay people. What are gay people, anyways? Is that a band or something? The original Sims game and its preceding sequels had the gargantuan task of simulating social reality. And oftentimes, our social reality is embedded in a system of political whatnots and social hoo-has. So when simulating those who's and ha's, how does one deal with the question of queerness? What does that even mean? It turns out that the question of sexual orientation and queerness complicates the gaming experience more than one would think. The Sims, which would soon become one of the best-selling video game series of all time, took multiple approaches to the construction of queerness over time. But what did these different approaches imply sociologically? What does it mean to simulate, see, and act out queerness? The answers are frustratingly ideological. You know what else is frustrating? The fact that you're not securing your data with Surfshark VPN. Surfshark VPN, where VPN stands for Virtual Private Network, keeps your online identity safe by encrypting all of the information sent between your device and the internet. This keeps your personal data protected from big companies, cyber criminals, or the heterosexual agenda. Also, a VPN swaps the real location of your device with a new one, aka changing your IP address. This way, you can virtually travel to any country around the globe. Think of the implications. Just by switching your country with Surfshark VPN, you can get access to globo, homo, gay content from Netflix that isn't available in your country. If you pay just a little bit more a month for Surfshark VPN, you can get access to the world's Netflix library, and you can use your account on an unlimited number of devices. And rest assured, you can bisexually watch shows like Wednesday in peace and privacy. Surfshark VPN makes sure that your city, country, and download history aren't linked to your identity. I guess bisexual people don't exist after all. It's okay, I can say that because I also don't exist. Use code AVILA to get 83% off plus 3 months free. And don't worry, Surfshark VPN offers a 30-day money-back guarantee, so there's no risk to try it out. So, click the link in the description and use code AVILA to get 83% off plus 3 months free. Meanwhile, in the 90s, the Sims team spends their days and nights debating the question of the homosexual. Are gay people real? Why do they walk so fast? It's too much. Maybe putting gay people in the game wasn't worth the risk. Electronic Arts, or EA, the company overseeing the game's development, wasn't super enthusiastic about The Sims in the first place. How could it ever capture the magic of Sim Ant? The risk was too high. The team decided that maybe gay people weren't worth it. In 1998, certified guy Patrick J. Barrett joined the Sims team. Just as Barrett joined the team, head programmer Jamie Dornbos took a quick vacation, leaving Jim McCratz in charge. To pass the time while the boss was away, McCratz handed Barrett some nice, light work, just to keep him occupied while the boss was gone. You know, just the entire outline of how social interactions work in the game. Unbeknownst to both dudes, temporary boss McCratz accidentally gave Barrett the old design document on social interactions, the one created before the team decided to tell gay people to go away. And Barrett, being a gay man himself, figured that gay people existing probably made sense, so he coded gay people back into the game. And what did the team think?
They just pretty much ignored it. After a while, everyone was just used to the design being there. It was widely expected that EA would just kill it anyways.
Just like a confused straight guy who doesn't know on which side to put the earring, the game was accidentally gay for a bit. Surely, though, EA would stand up for heterosexual rights soon enough, right? A bit of time passed, and Barrett had to make a demo to promote the game at E3, which consisted of 3 scenes from the upcoming Sims game. Usually, E3 presenters pre-planned these scenes, but Barrett was in a bit of a rush, as gay people always are. And so, while creating the wedding scene with a bunch of virtual guests, he didn't have time to plan and automate guest actions in the scene, so he just kind of let the code simulate some interactions. So, E3 arrived. This was the moment. If The Sims didn't get enough hype, then EA probably would kill the project. Everything was on the line. And then... lesbians. When presenting the wedding scene, 2 female Sims in the background fell in love and kissed. No one expected these lesbians, but E3 loved it. The Sims instantly went from a project on the verge of being canceled to the talk of the video game community. And apparently, there wasn't really a conservative backlash to the prospect, as Barrett states.
It was also a different time. People weren't so violently for or against same-sex relationships. They didn't go out of the way to find it and react to it. The right-wing press didn't have the platform they have today to scream. There was no Twitter, no Facebook, no blogs. I kinda hoped people would come at night with pitchforks and torches, but it never happened.
Alright, so now people expect gays in the game. Unfortunately, you can't just make a gay button and call it a day. Putting gays in the game isn't just a matter of doing it. Sexual orientation is a construct to be dealt with in The Sims. Where in real life, sexual orientation as a concept is complicated, historically contingent, and fluctuating, in a video game you have to deliberately program queerness in a way that makes sense to a computer. Since this program can never fully capture queerness as we experience it in our fruity little reality, the programmer is forced to make firm choices about what it means to experience queerness in the game. As a result, the programming of queerness will never be a neutral process. It's something that requires an ideological position because you're forced to answer the homoerotic question: what does it mean to be gay? Does being gay simply mean you identify as gay? Well, what about people who identify as straight but live a closeted gay life? Does it mean you exclusively have relationships or sex with the same gender? Well, what about those without experience or who are willingly celibate but hold same-gender attractions? What about those who identify as bisexual but then also use the word gay as an umbrella term? And if it's just a matter of attraction, then should the game allow those attractions to change, or should the attractions be fixed? The Sim team made a few decisions regarding sexual orientation. They created a construct called gender preference, defined by the genders your Sims are likely to flirt with or display attraction towards. Gender preference is determined by user-led interactions. If you wanted your Sims to have a certain preference, then the player has to perform that preference over time by flirting with genders that you want the Sim to display attraction for. Gender preference isn't something fixed, but something subject to change over time. In this framework of thinking, The programmers implicitly declared that sexual orientation was not something innately programmed into the Sims from birth. Sexual orientation emerges from a Sim's performance of that sexual orientation. It is a socially contingent role. That doesn't really match our standard Western conception of the gay, right? Like, in the modern Western context, we usually think of queerness as something innate, programmed or biologically wired to make us born this way. That's what we've come to accept as the norm. Yet the original Sims game departs from this notion, and through that departure makes an ideological statement. For the Sims, queerness is not something that is essential or innate, but it is something that is performed. It's a subversive role that disrupts dominant social roles. And that idea is actually a little radical. The claim that one performs queerness isn't the same as when conservatives claim that homosexuality is a choice. Queer theorists like Judith Butler claim that all sexual and gender identities are performative and socially constituted. Though our attractions aren't something we choose, the act of labeling and categorizing a person by their sexual attraction through an identity is an ideological choice. Perhaps there is no sexuality that predates or transcends our act of labeling it as a sexuality. The homosexual perhaps is not an object that is discovered in the trenches of a coffee shop with an overly designed blackboard. Perhaps the homosexual is a concept that we use to better understand different types of attractions. There's no fundamental reason that we should value the easy labeling of our attractions. We've just been brought up in a society that values objects that can be efficiently labeled. Who knows? Maybe there's a version of society where people don't find value in efficient categories. Maybe there's some other hypothetical version of society that actually values the complexity of sexuality and finds beauty in the refusal to label attractions in one fixed way. The point is, The Sims takes its own ideological perspective by refusing to fix Sims attractions and identity labels. And it's interesting, Sims don't come with a fixed sexuality. Their sexuality emerges from the social world and social interaction, as opposed to mine, which emerged from this picture of James McAvoy. The first Sims game states its position on sexuality in other, more obvious ways. Marriage between two Sims of the same gender wasn't allowed because of, the whole homophobia thing. Well done, society. And though gay Sims could adopt and raise children together, the game still labeled them as roommates. So, what is left to do when your roommate simulator becomes one of the best-selling computer games of all time? The Sims 2 was formally announced in May of 2003, though development began before the original Sims game was released. Now that The Sims had amassed a wide and dedicated player base, the development team wanted to know what it was about The Sims that had made the game so special, profitable. Developers wanted to create greater emotional connection between players and the game through dynamic social interactions, reactions, emotions, and graphics. The queer aspects of the game were just as visceral. The Sims 2 decided that gay people were still, in fact, real, and continued to allow same-gender relationships in the game. But in quite the 2004 move, same-gender couples still couldn't get married, but they could form a joined union. Attraction works through a similar mechanism to the first Sims game. Player-created Sims start out with neutral attractions that increase in either direction based on user interactions in the game. A cheat code in the game even allowed players to see what's up with their Sim sexuality, though the game never really labels attraction as gay or straight or bisexual or whatever. Instead, Sims had a gender preference. The Sims 2 gives us a slightly different queer ideology than the first Sims. Again, in the game, sexual orientation is not hardwired or innate, it is performed and configured. But some configurations of sexual orientation are ambiguously integrated into the Sims' legal institutions. Total letdown for fans of gay marriage, but some queers might argue that maybe queerness doesn't need to be integrated into the institution of marriage. I mean, hasn't the institution of marriage historically existed to codify one heterosexist template of the family, since it's just a product of the heteropatriarchy, post-capitalist, industrial modernity, privatization? Oh, right. The Sims 3 was released in 2009, the year we finally agreed that gay people had rights. Again, gender preferences wasn't a fixed thing, it still fluctuated with player interaction, but now, Sims of the same gender could get married. Holy matrimony! But wait, if gay Sims now enjoy the same life every other Sim enjoys, do gay Sims actually exist? Of course, Sims with same-gender preferences exist in The Sims 3, and you can basically fix your Sim to be gay if you never have them flirt with anyone of the same gender. However, if these same-sex practices have the full legal recognition of marriage in whatever post-capitalist suburbs The Sims portrays, is anyone actually gay? Think about it. Humans aren't born knowing the word gay. The word homosexual only emerged in the 19th century to classify and differentiate people who practice same-gender relations as an other. Not a single person on Earth had ever said the word homosexual in their language until an Austrian guy invented it in the 19th century. The concept of the homosexual as an identity rather than a practice was invented in the modern age to classify, differentiate, and ultimately oppress people of non-traditional backgrounds. The word has gone a long way now, but that's its history. In The Sims 3, same-sex marriage is just a marriage. Unions between two people are labeled the same, regardless of gender. And as far as I know, there's no discrimination against queer people programmed into The Sims. But this goes further. There's no queer community in The Sims. There's no traces of the long battle for marriage equality. No flags, no parades, no Macklemore. Essentially, there's no way to recognize queerness as a distinct object, construct, and community. And if that's true, then perhaps gay people in The Sims 3 don't actually exist at all. If a gay tree falls in the forest and no one is around to hear it, is it still gay? In The Sims 3, the construct of a queer sexual orientation ceases to exist. The orientations may seem queer to us in the real world, but in The Sims, the sexual orientation isn't really a thing. There is no queer if there is no norm to disrupt. Is this supposed to be Utopia? Some might say that a world without distinction is Utopia, but does it feel like one? Does Utopia necessitate the extinction of particularity, differentiation, and identity? It's a question The Sims 4 had to deal with 5 years later and still deals with today. In 2014, The Sims 4 debuted to lukewarm reception. Forgetting Luke, though, every Sim was in practice bisexual, and from what I can gather, in the first version of The Sims 4, it appears that gender preference either didn't exist or played less of a role in how Sims interacted. In 2014, if Sims of the same gender flirted with your Sim and you've been playing your Sim as straight the whole live, laugh, and loving time, then sorry, there's a 100% chance that your straight Sim isn't. Now, it may be the case that straight people don't exist at your local liberal arts college cesspool, but some people, believe it or not, play it straight. Back in the day, the inability to make heterosexual Sims ignited a fiery debate on the Sims forums. People were split.
I prefer not having gender preferences in the game since sexuality is a spectrum and not an either-or binary option. That's fine for Tumblr, but here in the real world, this game is trying to make my Sim a lesbian. Katrina, the firstborn of Josh and Gabriella, keeps getting notices saying she has strong feelings for another girl, and now they are romantic interests with this Emma chick. I don't like how this game just decides stuff for your Sims. Is there any way I can fix this? If she's gonna be a lesbian, I will hook her up with someone else. Emma Lancaster is... The game decides that your Sim is going to pee on the floor, leave your baby out in the snow, and throw tantrums when they can't walk around a table. I'm not sure why your Sim having romantic feelings for another girl is that big of a deal.
Should The Sims 4 let players write gay people out of their straights-only game? If not, then what about the gays who want to create a gay postmodern neo-Marxist commune full of Sims who may or may not resemble Scottish actor James McAvoy? In that case, heterosexuality just wouldn't be realistic. For a while, The Sims 4 continued on without sexual orientation and gender preference. The Sims had once again created a world without distinction. This early version of The Sims 4 seems to be the ideal end of any liberal democracy. Everyone is equal, there's no differentiation between subjects, Anyone who disagrees with this vision of humanity must be a homophobe, right? Well, a lot of queer people seek distinction. They often define themselves through distinction. Queer people seek the particular. That's why the Sims 4 LGBT mod was so popular. What's a mod? A mod is downloadable user-generated content that you could add to your game to spice things up. Do you want to add fart sounds? Go onto some random website and get the fart mod. Cannibalism? Sure. Gay identity? Oh, you're serious? Okay, weirdo. Why would someone specifically want to add the words homosexual in their game? It might seem odd when The Sims 4 already presents us with a seemingly perfect world. In The Sims 4, you can participate in queer relations, and that participation doesn't mark you as an other. It doesn't make you different. Sexual orientation isn't even an identity or a concept, it just is. Isn't the goal of queer civil rights movements to completely integrate with the social world? Well, what does integration mean exactly? Does it mean that queer history and all of its victories and tragedies have to disappear? If it does, then does the disappearance of that history actually alienate queer players more than embracing queer history? Perhaps the alienation of integration inspired the creation of the various LGBT mods for The Sims 4. With these mods, you can have your Sims come out as various identities, have your Sims experience homophobia, or even make your Sims homophobic. For some, The Sims 4's utopic vision missed the particularity of the human experience. We often thrive in spaces that celebrate shared histories, because a general sense of I fit in with everyone else doesn't cut it for some people. For some, sure, but for others, it doesn't feel like a full freedom. It feels like one is just another subject. The Sims 4 attempted to address its lack of particularity in multiple ways. In 2016, The Sims 4 added features that allowed players to customize Sims' gender experience, features, and presentation in a variety of ways. Before, certain physiques and styles of dress were only available if you selected a certain gender. But in 2016, the update lifted these restrictions. In the words of EA, you could create Sims with any type of physique, walk style, and tone of voice you choose, regardless of their gender. It was a good step for trans representation in the game. Another way The Sims 4 tackled these desires for distinction, the 2022 Sexual Orientation Update. With this update, you could select if your Sim is attracted to a certain gender, whether or not this romantic attraction is flexible, and the Sim's willingness to sexually experiment. It's obviously binary and perhaps more akin to a poorly worded social survey. Though a recent update allows players to set Sims pronouns, the team acknowledged that they still have a ways to go in this regard. Despite these issues, some players praise the ability to finally explicitly set Sims orientations. This new update finally answers our initial question. What does it mean to simulate, see, and act out queerness? In this final iteration, queerness is no longer something performed. It is no longer a practice. It is an identity programmed by a set of parameters. Is this what we should have been looking forward to? If we look back on The Sims' different ways of handling sexual orientation, would it be right to say The Sims has come a long way? Or The Sims has progressed on the issue of sexual orientation? Or even The Sims simulation of sexual orientation has only gotten more accurate over time? Because to believe that queerness is best expressed through labeling, regulation, control, or fixity is to believe that queerness is best expressed through the post-19th century dominant Western view of queerness. And is that dominant Western conception of queerness really the goal of a movement of liberation? Is it even something that queer people should be happy to have for now? Or is it a tool that simply locates one as a subject within a social system? Let's talk about ideology. What is ideology? In a sociological context, ideology simply describes the ideas and beliefs that justify particular social arrangements. Ideology wakes you up at 7 a.m. It joins you on your 2-hour commute, and it guides the hand that types at your office desk. It is the force that lets society function the way it does. The Sims is a firmly ideological game, but again, what isn't ideology? Everything contains an ideological element. Ideology exists where you would never expect it. Even,
In the traditional German toilet, the hole into which shit disappears after we flush is right at the front, so that the shit is first laid out for us to sniff and inspect for traces of illness. In the typical French toilet, on the contrary, the hole is at the back, i.e. the shit is supposed to disappear as quickly as possible. Finally, the American Anglo-Saxon toilet presents a synthesis, a mediation between these opposites. The toilet basin is full of water, so that the shit floats in it, visible but not to be inspected. It is clear that none of these versions can be accounted for in purely utilitarian terms. Each involves a certain ideological perception of how the subject should relate to the excrement. Reflective thoughtfulness, German. Revolutionary hastiness, French. Utilitarian pragmatism, English.
Does this quote from Slavoj Žižek make sense? Frustratingly, it does, and it doesn't, which is kind of the point of ideology. Ideology is never obvious. It is the mechanism that makes us into a subject. It compels us to take a given state of affairs for granted. Of course that's how a toilet's supposed to look. There's no other way it could ever look. During the development of the first Sims game, the game was often mockingly referred to as the toilet game, nodding to the fact that much of the game involves sitting on toilets, cleaning toilets, buying toilets, fixing toilets. But did the developers ever think about which ideology their toilet would reflect? The one of revolutionary hastiness, reflective thoughtfulness, or utilitarian pragmatism? The Sims claims to be a life simulation game. But if we really want to describe the reality portrayed in The Sims, it's more like a contemporary suburban capitalist America simulation game. There's nothing neutral about The Sims. It doesn't simulate life, it doesn't simulate toilets, it simulates a particular type of life. A particular type of toilet. Will Wright, creator of The Sims, intended the game to be a satire of American culture.
It was actually meant to be a satire of US culture, and I think most people didn't get that.
The game is supposed to take the American suburban dream and use it to stress you the f*** out. Yet, however much Wright intended his game to be satirical, the actual critique in the game isn't that obvious. Wright states himself that most people miss the critical aspect of the game. Perhaps the satire didn't get translated because it's too close to reality. People playing the game in their stressful pursuit of the American dream didn't see the satire in chasing misery. Players think, oh, this is just what life is like.
The Sims created a realistic world, but then just made you conform in it.
Which brings me to a guy. Louis Althusser, a French Marxist. Didn't he kill his wife? Louis Althusser, French Marxist theorist, claimed that the capitalist state conditions us to be loyal subjects through two state apparatuses. Well, that's a gross simplification. It's disgusting, actually. And so are repressive state apparatuses. The repressive state apparatus, the first of these state apparatuses, includes the police and military, entities which I'd say have received mixed critical reception. RSAs use explicit state force and violence to make people do stuff. The other state apparatuses are the ideological state apparatuses, which, suck, but in a way Rotten Tomatoes can quantify. Ideological state apparatuses, or ISAs, create the subject and subordinate the working class through cultural means. These include schools, media outlets, churches, those pristine tourist brochures you see at three-star hotels, the family, and more. A surprising amount of secondary academic literature uses Althusser's theories to understand The Sims. Scholars characterize The Sims games as ideological state apparatuses. The Sims projects an image of suburban American lifestyle. It obliges us to take that lifestyle for granted, and it forces us to envision success in terms of consumption, status, and career advancement. Essentially, The Sims presents itself as a life simulator, but in reality only simulates and idealizes capitalist suburban America.
By encouraging players to work and earn money to have more friends and master the game's happiness, what The Sims does is a process of presenting the player with the representation of the relations with the means of production. That is, according to Althusser, ideology. It practices a double alienation of the individual in the Althusserian sense. Given the alienating relations with the means of production that avoid misfits to have a place in the system, the game The Sims encourages players to forget about that alienation by giving them the illusion of free will, equality of rights, as long as their lives are productive to the system.
You might have heard people say that ideology brainwashes us and hides the truth about reality. You're probably talking to a Marxist, in which case, just tell them to go away by reminding them how much student debt they have. Long after Marx died, Althusser provided an alternative definition of ideology. According to Althusser, ideology does not mask the truth of reality. It creates reality. Humans create language, language gives the world meaning, and creates our daily realities. And since we can only understand the world through these human-created languages, we're kind of stuck with the ideology that's lodged into our language and symbols. This ideology then compels us to take a role in reality, to take on a subject position. It makes us into teachers, students, players, gays, poopers, and it eventually gives these roles social meanings and a set of associated practices. We fulfill these subject positions thinking that they're just the natural state of how people should act. Again, on The Sims.
In other words, if a player is motivated to want something through the game narrative and ludic structure, a false feeling of freedom is experienced. When the setting is laid out well enough, it does not even occur to the player to want something that does not fit together with the ideology.
One of the most imperceptible but important ways The Sims spreads the ideology of modern life is in the way The Sims attempts to represent sexual orientation in a universal, dehistoricized way. Let's ponder. In The Sims games, there's no racism, homophobia, or sexism in the explicit sense. There's no wage gap, although in some earlier games, female-coded careers earn less money than other careers and offered less opportunities for advancement, but there's mostly no wage gap. There's no residential segregation based on race. There's no homophobic bullies pushing kids into dark corners. No James Corden. The atrocities and inequalities inherent to the contemporary world, the inequalities that exist around us that built modernity, are nowhere to be seen in The Sims games. And in omitting those harsh realities and histories from the game, The Sims subtly implies that our contemporary world can be separated from the exploitation that built it. And again, I'm not saying that The Sims needs to be a racism simulator. We already have Twitter for that. The Sims rather represents the larger structural ways ideology encourages us to forget that our surrounding world looks the way it does for a reason. For example, based on historical scholarship and the rants of some bald French people, we know that sexual orientation as we conceive of it in Western society is socially constructed. Now, we don't choose our romantic and sexual attractions, but society changes the way we talk and think about romantic and sexual attraction as an identity. In the 19th century, this Austrian guy invented the categories homosexual and heterosexual. And from then on, the categorizing of sexuality has facilitated the differentiation and oppression of these groups. It's really easy to marginalize people once you categorize groups of people into social categories. The word homosexual created an identity that was then used by psychiatric organizations and governments to pathologize and regulate queer bodies. This way of thinking about human beings is embedded into the histories that built the contemporary world portrayed in The Sims. And to forget the ways exploitation is built into that world kinda sucks. That isn't to say that the word homosexual can't mean something positive now, but it does mean that the journey to the modern meaning of homosexual is important to remember. Do I expect The Sims to ideally represent a perfect non-ideological universe where players live in a post-communist gay space utopia? Yes. No, I don't expect any game to take on that nearly impossible burden, unless it's Dream Daddy, a dad dating simulator. Still, we can use The Sims as one example of how the larger social structure works. The ways ideological state apparatuses like The Sims construct our perception of reality affects our ability to change it. Another example. Will Wright modeled The Sims after the American suburb. Now personally, if I were making a list called, "I'm not sure how these things are racist, but I have a hunch they are," I would definitely include the term freedom fries, German philosopher Immanuel Kant, ranch dressing, and of course, the American suburb. Luckily, sociologists study this sort of thing, so we know why. In the early 1930s, there was a housing shortage, and home ownership was in the process of plummeting, thanks to America's Little Depressive episode. Whoa, what if we passed the National Housing Act of 1934, establishing the Federal Housing Administration and providing FHA-secured loans with smaller down payments, resulting in increased access to housing for low-income families? What a great idea! What if we made it racist? Yep. And so America basically only gave out housing loans to white people. The government thought that if they let non-white people buy mortgages in the suburbs, that the property values in the area would decline. Which actually wasn't true, since African Americans tended to pay more for properties than whites due to the low supply afforded to people of color. In summary, the Federal Housing Administration subsidized the creation of the suburbs and then purposefully made it white, which helps explain why residential patterns are still pretty segregated by race and why the wealth gap between white and black Americans is so large. Like insanely large. And that's just the racist history of the suburbs, lest we forget how American suburban culture perpetuates the idea of heterosexual female domesticity and how the nuclear family, the central figure of this suburban culture, has always been used in opposition to queer families and non-traditional queer family styles. Second-wave feminism only came into the mainstream eye after Betty Friedan published The Feminine Mystique, which criticized this suburban, cis-heterosexist definition of womanhood common in middle-class American life. Which brings us back to The Sims. Racism, sexism, and homophobia aren't written into the games, but these elements are certainly embedded in suburban American culture. Yet, in The Sims, there's no explicit racism, sexism, or homophobia, no traces of the history that helped build the suburbs. The Sims' separation of the suburbs from its troubled history isn't just ahistorical, it's ideological. The game encourages players to become subjects of the American capitalist system, to aim towards a career, towards a heterosexual nuclear family, towards the racist, sexist, and heteronormative image of the American dream. And just like all ideologies perpetuated by ideological state apparatuses, it does not claim to be an ideology. It presents itself as a natural representation of life. Now again, not canceling The Sims, I could analyze anything with this lens and come to a similar conclusion, which is also kind of the point. Ideology is everywhere. Let's return to the topic of queerness more specifically. In what other ways does The Sims make us into subjects, and how does this connect to the reason why The Sims is especially important for queer people? The answer lies in another question. Does queerness come from within or without? Is queerness an externally imposed identity that tries to box certain traits into recognizable but imperfect labels, or is queerness an innate characteristic with an inner truth that a person expresses? Within or without? Contemporary Western society compels us to believe that queerness comes from within. We are made to believe that our sexual attractions or gender identities are completely internal experiences that we then project onto the world. This is probably true to some extent. I can feel my fifis when I see pretty man picture. Maybe even a majority of what constitutes our identity is internal. But our cultures also conditions the way we think about our queer identities. So we have to admit that queerness has to be, in part, externally determined. Queerness also comes from without. In creating this video, I asked members of my audience to fill out a survey about The Sims, and one section asked, has playing The Sims games ever played a role in how you have come to understand your sexuality, your experience with gender, or how you view your gender and sexuality? Please elaborate below in as little or as much detail as you would like. And so they did. Answers definitely varied. Most respondents were queer, and among these queer responses, a few themes emerged, split into two categories of play style. In the first style, people consciously identified with the Sims they played with. That is, they used the Sims to play themselves. They put themselves into a situation and lived vicariously through the game. I made a Sim. It's me. My Sim husband resembles Paul McCartney out of pure coincidence. In the second play style, players didn't do that. They made and manipulated Sims that they didn't identify as themselves. I made this group of Sims. They're objects I play around with, and they just happen to resemble the Beatles in a polyamorous polycule. Queer people who explicitly identified with their created Sims often use the game to affirm their existing queer identity or to explore queer relationships. For example, in real life, they may have lived in an area that rejected their identity, and they use the Sims to create a version of themselves that they could customize to affirm that identity. One person stated,
"The character creation, especially since the expanded gender/sex traits options update, has been great for exploring my desired expression and genderqueer identity. It's private and low risk, but I can see myself and my friends in the characters I make."
Another participant commented,
"Particularly the high degree of customization in regards to identity, sexuality, presentation, etc. in The Sims 4 has given me the opportunity to better imagine myself as a woman and to play out transition long before I had ever considered it for me."
These responses make sense. People use The Sims as a safe space for self-exploration, but the other half of the sample had a different, uniquely interesting experience. These players didn't intentionally create themselves in The Sims, but they certainly made their Sims do queer things that either helped players realize their own queerness, either in that moment or at a later point in their life. Some of these participants directly realized their own queerness through queering their third-person Sims characters. But others, despite queering the Sims early on, didn't come to identify as queer until later on in life.
The Sims played a role in how I understand my sexuality without me realizing it fully. I always played with female Sims falling in love with one another while I was still identifying as straight IRL. Guess I was living my true life through my Sims unconsciously. Yes, at the time I didn't really notice it, but looking back, it's clear that I would test out my attraction to women on my Sims, spending lots of time creating cute, attractive girls on Create a Sim, making them flirt, kiss, woohoo, marry each other, etc. Probably because the game was a place where I felt comfortable doing so. At the time, I hadn't consciously noticed my queerness yet. I only knew I had felt different from most people around me, and The Sims gave me an opportunity to explore that without even realizing I was doing so.
If queerness comes from within, as modern society tells us it does, then how do we account for these stories? How does one not know if they're queer if queerness definitely and supposedly emerges from the individual? Obviously, when we're younger, we often don't have the language to speak about our feelings or experiences because the language of queerness has been historically censored, or we just don't know how to talk about it. But again, if queerness is completely internal, shouldn't we at least know that we're attracted to certain genders or that our gender identities orient themselves a certain queer way? Maybe that's not true for all of us. Maybe we don't know that our attractions or orientations are queer or different until a language and culture gives us the option to be different. Jacques Lacan was a 20th century French psychoanalyst, which basically means that he was like the gay version of Freud. Sigmund Freud was a really rude Austrian guy who invented a bunch of discredited theories about the human mind with minimal application in contemporary clinical psychology. But just because Freud said that gay people were weirdos and that people want to bone their moms, doesn't mean that his theories are completely useless. Some of the fundamental principles of his theoretical work found a new home in philosophy, literary criticism, social theory, and sociology later in the 20th century. How? Well, fundamental to Freud's thought is the notion that human action is driven by unconscious forces. This is in contrast to utilitarian economists, for example, which say stupid shit like, well, human action is driven by rational utility-maximizing actors. Or Marxists, who say less stupid shit like, human action is driven by the relations of production in a given society. The lens Freud provided through psychoanalysis brings a certain subjective and psychological element to the study of society and social experience. That brings us back to Jacques Lacan. He saw what Freud was doing and said, that's cute, but what if I made this a little more French and also harder to understand? Which is exactly what he did. But in a way, Lacan's theories, like other theoretical works, actually allow us to make a lot of sense of complex human experiences. Lacan proposed that when we're born, when we look like those horribly wrinkled potatoes, we enter the world experiencing reality in a way we'll never experience again. As babies, we have no concept of self or other. We experience no separation between the external world, other people, and ourselves. It's the closest we'll ever get to the pure materiality of existence, the real. Everything is one. That is, until we enter the mirror stage. One day, a few months after our birth, we see ourselves in the mirror. We see our own image and begin to identify ourselves with that image. We come into existence at that point as a mental self. Lacan calls this the mirror stage. According to Lacan, we grow to hate and love the image at the same time. We hate it because we believe it is better than ourselves, and we love it because we want to be like the image. We realize that this image of ourselves we see in the mirror isn't connected to the world around us in the way we previously thought. Confronting this fact, the image produces a sense of loss. The Sims, this simulation of life, is a mirror to our own reality. Queer people play the game. We burn some food, piss ourselves, and perhaps at some point, we make two dudes fall in love. Maybe we don't identify with the queerness of that moment because our queer selves haven't come into existence yet. We're still in touch with the real of The Sims. There is no self, and there is no other. There is no distinction between player and game and sim, between queer and not queer. The player does not enter the game until the crucial moment they begin to identify with it. Perhaps for you, this realization didn't happen in The Sims. Perhaps it was another piece of media that created this moment of self-recognition, that moment when queer identity first comes into place for the first time. As Lacan describes it, the creation of the self, of the queer self, is defined by a separation. You only become a self when this image of yourself becomes an other. Queer identity only emerges when we begin to identify with an external image of ourselves, when our internal experience somehow align themselves with whatever external mirror we encounter. At some point, when you play The Sims, you begin to see yourself. Yet this self-image only comes into existence when we imagine queerness as something outside ourselves, when we see queerness as an other, as separate from the innate experience we've held up to that point. If queerness is defined as a disruption of the status quo, then we only begin to identify with that disruption when we see ourselves in the other, as the other. Soon after, we grab onto the language of queerness, the signifiers of queerness, and the symbolic order of queerness, and we subject ourselves to that meaning. Queerness, then, doesn't appear to us first as an internal experience that only emerges from our brains or our DNA or our hormones. Everything is externally conditioned by language and cultural meaning, including our most intimate and personal identities. We aren't born queer, we become queer. And in that sense, The Sims is an ideological game in the way it makes us into subjects, queer subjects, that can only experience our queer subjectivities or our queer selves by seeing ourselves as others, as queer, and all the social meaning imbued with that otherness. We become people with these queer identity labels as others who can only become subjects through the expectation to participate in a capitalist system from the subject position of a queer person. In concrete terms, capitalist systems, through their ideological apparatuses, give us identities that tend to turn us into queer consumers, queer drone pilots, queer markets that have commodifiable cultures and experiences. I don't want it, Target! Perhaps it's the permanent condition of a conscious being to forever long for an unreachable, raw reality of material existence, but it is a temporary condition to treat our longing through capitalist narratives of individual consumerism, commodification, and exploitation. We don't have to define the queer subject by what queer people consume. We can define our queerness in terms of how it disrupts the status quo. The Sims isn't the enemy, but of course, it's implicated in a long chain of things that are themselves implicated in the social system. You're implicated, I'm implicated, queerness is implicated, and complicated. Though queerness is socially constructed, though identities like bisexual, homosexual, asexual, and so on are conditioned by the social world, if you can find beauty and meaning in these identities, despite their construction and social contingency, that shouldn't minimize that connection you hold to an identity. In fact, that should speak to the unique ability of queerness to bring people together as a community. Our identities as queer subjects are defined by a historical tendency towards subversion, particularity, and difference. And this gives queer communities a unique position to fight against hierarchical regimes and the process of subjugating people in the first place. But gay Sims communes should do for now. I love the Sims games. I've spent too many years of my formative life repeating the same gay love stories over and over, and in a way, The Sims prepared me for the queer life that I live now. The Sims provides a special platform for configuring one's own queerness. Because of the way you can directly manipulate social situations in The Sims, the game imperfectly connects to our human experience of queerness, and thus more directly affects the early ways queer people have practiced or conceived of their queerness. And it's this eternal tension that I find so interesting. The Sims is simultaneously a space where queer people have all the freedom in the world to make the gayest life imaginable, at the same time that The Sims plays an active role in orienting us towards a certain vision of a queer consumer subject. The player queers the game space at the same time that this game space plays a formative role in queer identity formation. I guess, in the end, I'm left with one final question. When you play The Sims, do you queer The Sims? Or does The Sims queer you? You decide.
Hey, gay. You want to act gaily daily? Well, here's a few ways you can do that. Support this channel by checking out my merch at www.itsall.gay, or consider supporting me on Patreon. Also, remember to follow my Twitter, Tumblr, and Instagram. Don't forget to subscribe. Anyways, these are some people who are acting gaily daily. My patrons: Enoch Koo, M Dash, Aaron Seiler, Adeline Grubb, AFK Bard, Aiden Iftikhar, Akane SVT, Alice H, Allison, Alston, Amanda Hasela, Amanda S, Amara, Amelia Zeke, Anna, Anarkali Iskari, Andy H, Anna Reek, Armin Newsom, Ashby A, Asimpti, Otto Moore, Avery, B, Baileography, Batia Rabin, Becca Bradford, Bianca Moten, Brad the Great, Brian Lasoya, Brooke, Bump Girl, Violet, Cara Miller, Carla Carroll, Cartwheel, Catboy Girl, Cece Troya, Charles Hero, Charlotte, Chester Snap, Chris Hubley, Cillian Trouble, Clara Lindner, Cody Miller, Koyasim, Colin Coltrera, Conscious Logic, Cucumber, Kurt Clark, Cynthia Perez, Sivis, D. Ann, Dairy Dude, Dane Much, Danny Chalice, Daniel Montgomery, Daniel Prokop, Darren Mad, David, Daisy Granados, De Cassowary, Del Elliott, Domenica K, Draenix, Dracanis, E, Aesthetic, Elena Bellows, Elena Amesqua, Ellen, Elizabeth Morgan, Emily, Emma Anastasi, Esper Lady, Ethan Thompson, Evan P, Evelyn Rose Connor, Extra Virgin Olive Oil, Faranak Kashmiri, Florencia Rumpel Rodriguez, Gabriella Bradley, Gabriella Day, Gally, Garrett Black, Georgia, Georgia Rose, Gina Wallace, Grace, Grace Vincent, Graham Colbeans, Gray Rainier, Hank, Hannah O, Hannah G0123, Heather Frasechild, Howl the Magician, I Am the Fernman, Ian T. Gray, Ingelis Whitfelder, It's a Me, Emily, Izzy the Alien, Jack, Jackie Benavente, Jacob T. Rapp, Jake the Snake Bakes a Cake by the Lake, Janin, Jared, J. Patrick, Jennifer M. Isaguirre, Jessica Carmona, Justin 3, Jonathan De Vicente, Juicebox08, Julian Casper, June, Jurassic Dragon, Justin Chapman, Just Some Sentient Matter, Ka, K, Kale, Caleb, Karen Mullen, Cassicist, Kimmy Giggler, Knights Who Say Sledge, Kuro, Kyle Denley, Lauren Taylor, Lee O, Leela, Leonardus Sardinianus, Levi Margolis, Lillian, Lily, Lindsay Laney, Linz, Little Rin, Little Pihuyo, Liz Hirschman, Lorenzo J. Yanez Jr., Lucia Garcia, Luna Autumn, Mackenzie Robin, Madeline, Maggie H., Matey, Malpertuous, Manwi, Mark Kirby, Margot White, Maria Raposa Branca, Marshall Mazingale, Marta, Matthew Franklin, Mason T., Megalomaniac 64, Megan, Meggie and Lars, Mejun, Mel,
Melbourne,
Melonbug, Mary, Merle, Mykova, Miguel Galan de Juana, Miranda, Moye, Misa VKT, Mysterious DG, Mysterious Persona, Nadine Ferris, Natasha Troom, Nicholas Bloom, Nick, Nifan, Omni Technomancer, Oyster Philosophy, Paige, Paul, Perdita, Peter, Patrick, and Mary, Politesse, Queen Cockroach, RBE, Rain and Chaos, Rafe, Ray J, Rebecca Blask, Bread Sparky, RH, Richard Knight, Roman Rosari, Ronja Adams Ramstead, Rosa Mori of the Sea, RSS, Saleya, Fate Replay, Sam Cotter, Sam Kilkenny, Samantha Bonaparte, Shatsu, Scrimbim, Sebastian Rose, Serafina, Satham Bitch, Shandon Largo, Shane Tilakaratni, Shannon Hutchinson, Shannon M, Sid, Sinai Cruz, Cece, Solberg Birgisdotir, Suit Sprite, Soup, Squiggly Ghostwriter, Stacy Every, Steffi, Stephen N, Tangerine 15, Tanya P, Taylor White, The Kimchi Witch, The Salsa, Thomas M. Paflans, Tiff Rodriguez, Talura, Tom Tripp, Tor, Tyler Connolly, Umaima Baig, Valerie Astra, Venom Titties, Veronica Jurasova, Violet Anair, Wen, Wainoa, Whitney Welts, Willow Bird, Ren Martin, Xylon Akau MSTS, Your Mom,